Hey class, let's talk about the autonomic nervous system. But before we do, let's put it in the context of the broader nervous system from the drawing we used previously, which looked like this. The central nervous system is just the brain and spinal cord. Everything else you see here is the peripheral nervous system. There are a few structures, but mostly what this is nerves. Afferent nerves with information arriving at the CNS, sensory information coming in, and efferent nerves with uh, information exiting and having an effect on the body. So the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, is part of this efferent system. Now, when you send a motor command out of your brain or spinal cord, sometimes you consciously used your mind to decide to move a part of your body. If you decide to move something, it's skeletal muscle in almost all cases. And so that skeletal muscle is under voluntary control, or we call it somatic control. In fact, you can call this process that you hear using your somatic nervous system, or you can call it the somatic branch of your nervous system or whatever. But what about when your heart rate changes? What about when your smooth muscle decides to cause contractions to move food through your stomach and into your intestines? Or what about when glands are activated or deactivated? All of that happens automatically. That's all part of the ANS, the autonomic nervous system. So here it says that's autonomic control. It doesn't matter the details here. The key word is autonomic. Whether you want to call it the autonomic nervous system, the branch, the division, the subdivision, is not important. Let's just call it the ANS, the autonomic nervous system. So when you stimulate that cardiac muscle or smooth muscle or glands, the question is, are you using it to prepare the body for into some state of arousal, a fight or flight situation? Or are you stimulating those muscles and glands to enter a state of relaxation or rest? Because these are the two branches of the ANS. And this is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the day today. But before we do, to kind of help us understand the ANS, let's look at that somatic nervous system. When you decide to voluntarily control your skeletal muscle, which means you're going to send out an excitatory signal to contract that muscle, how does that happen? And the short story is that command comes from the primary motor cortex in your frontal lobe, travels down into the spinal cord, and from there, you're going to send out this long neuron. Let's say you want to wiggle your big toe. There's a neuron, it's the longest in your body. It'll go from the base of your spinal cord down your leg and reach the end of your big toe. So that's one neuron. It extends all the way from the CNS to the effector, the muscle. The reason I'm telling you this is that something different goes on in the ANS. When you're moving these involuntary muscles like cardiac and smooth muscle or glands to have these routine adjustments to your body's systems, that is going to use this sequential two neuron pathway. So here's the CNS, here's the effector, and there's not one long neuron, there's two. Where the first neuron ends and the next begins, we're going to call that a ganglion. Ganglion is like a cell body, or really a cluster of cell bodies in the PNS, right? Because that blue box shows us the central nervous system. We're not in there anymore. So we're in the peripheral nervous system. We've got this cluster of cell bodies making a little island on their own. That's a ganglion. So we can call this neuron a preganglionic neuron before the ganglion, and this is a postganglionic neuron. Or you can call this a preganglionic axon, and this is the postganglionic axon. The point is that this is the system used in almost every situation in the ANS, with one exception, but it's this two neuron pathway. What that means is, as you form these ganglion, you can find them. You can look for these in a cadaver. They're visible structures because thousands of these synapses are formed in one spot and make this big clump of gray matter. So these are real structures in your body. So before we look at that a little bit farther, we'll just finish up by recognizing that when we talk about the ANS, there's actually three divisions or subdivisions. The sympathetic division we can call fight or flight for short. But really, that's active at any times of stress or exertion or, sure, emergency. If right now you're sitting up, alert, taking notes, or interacting with the material, you're under some stress. I mean, even if you're sitting up and staring out at the window and thinking about Netflix, then you're still under some kind of stressor because you're actually staying upright. A stressor is anything that uses your body's energy. So even just by sitting up, you're activating your sympathetic division of your nervous system. If you're resting, you're using this parasympathetic division. Sometimes it's called rest and digest, or feed and breed, or rest and repose. These all have to do with like non-essential, non-emergency organ systems being more active. Really, we're always kind of in between these, but we'll talk more about that later on. We won't really talk about the enteric division of the ANS later on, but it's worth a mention. There's this mesh-like system of neurons that's just all over your GI tract. And it's been called even the second brain because when I say mesh-like neurons, I'm talking tons of neurons. 500 million, that's 5 times more than your spinal cord has. This other place said it's 2/3 as many neurons as a cat. So just these gut neurons in your body are almost as smart as a cat. And this is controlling a lot of these visceral reflexes. So all this stuff with digestion, as sphincters are opening and closing, the food needs to be moved through the GI tract, but it also has to be mixed within the GI tract. And the timing of all that relies on a pretty sophisticated situation. And then you get into regulating appetite and all that. So it's a complex system, and the enteric division of the ANS is responsible for it. But we'll focus on our sympathetic division, and then we'll circle back in the next video for parasympathetic division. So the sympathetic division. This page here captures a lot of information about this division, and we won't go through all the details here, but here's what I want you to take away from this image. First is that this red section is indicating that anytime any of your organs, whether it be your pupils or salivary glands or your bladder or your ovaries, any of those that change because we activate this fight or flight response, because we activate the sympathetic nervous system, any of those changes, that signal originates from this portion of your spinal cord, from the thoracolumbar region. That's going to be different in parasympathetic. That's why I want to notice it. So this red section is highlighting that any of those signals, if your heart races, if your breathing increases, if your stomach, shuts down, ties up in knots, all those signals, those motor commands come from this portion of the spinal cord. The next thing we want to notice is that there's this key of red and black. Red is preganglionic fibers or neurons or axons, and the black is the postganglionic fibers or neurons or axons, whatever you want to call it. Remember, it's a 2-neuron sequential pathway. And look at this though. If I want to, we're in fight or flight, so your mouth might get dry. If I want to send a signal to my salivary glands to stop making saliva, I'm going to have one neuron that's going to go just a couple inches away from my spinal cord, like this far. That's the first neuron. Then I'm going to meet the next neuron, the postganglionic neuron, and send a signal, all the rest of the way to the salivary glands. So there's a very short neuron and then a very long neuron. If I want to shut down my ovaries and uterus, not worried in a fight or flight situation about planning an ovulation or something, I'm going to send a signal, um, this red preganglionic neuron, this little bit of a distance to this circled structure here, and then that will travel down to the gonads. So again, short and then long. If you look here, there's just this one exception, but otherwise these red neurons are short and then the black neurons are long. That will be different in the parasympathetic nervous system. And the last thing I want to notice is just that these little ball-shaped structures that are going up and down the spinal cord, those are all ganglia, where one neuron meets another. And then these three structures, I've added this extra black circle to really make sure you can see those. Those are also ganglia. The parasympathetic nervous system will have different ganglia. So this is what we're focusing on, those kind of three things. Where we are in the spinal cord, the short, then the long fiber, and these little balls all up and down the spinal cord, and these balls, these ganglia. And this is repeating a little bit of that. It's just showing us to remember that there are these pre and post ganglionic neurons. But now we can name the ganglia. So the sympathetic chain ganglia, this chain that's going parallel to the spinal cord, are the sympathetic chain ganglia. They're also called the paravertebral ganglia, which is also a good name. It just means next to the vertebrae. The collateral ganglia are here and here and here, those other three circles I made. And what we're saying is just that some of the parts of the body that you'll send messages to, the neurons make a ganglion in this chain. Other times, the ganglion is made elsewhere in the body in these collateral ganglia. Or, and here's the one exception to this whole 2-neuron pathway rule, don't forget, your hypothalamus directly innervates your adrenal medulla to tell it to release epinephrine. So in a fight or flight response, you also release epinephrine. That signal is kind of a whole different story. So there's this long red neuron causing that direct innervation of the adrenal medulla. Let's take a closer look at these collateral ganglia. They just look like they're floating here, but actually those are found on your descending aorta. It's kind of hanging out attached to this big blood vessel. And they have specific jobs to do. If you're in a fight or flight situation, so if your sympathetic nervous system is activated, a lot of these organs, like especially having to do with digestion, are not very critical. So you'll send messages to them to kind of subdue their actions. And those signals will come out of the celiac ganglion. That's the most superior of those three collateral ganglia. If you've heard of celiac disease, right, it's like a kind of an intestinal issue. Like, think about, it means belly is what celiac is. So it's a digestive issue. Underneath the celiac ganglion is the superior mesenteric ganglion. And this is innervating mostly your small intestine. Again, we don't really want to worry about digestion when our sympathetic nervous system is very active. So this will kind of subdue or repress some of that activity. The inferior mesenteric ganglion, a little farther down, the most inferior of these three, innervates the large intestine, rectum, bladder, and sex organs. Again, digestion, urinary processes, reproduction are not very important if you are in a high stress situation. So all of these ganglia are where one neuron just hands off the signal to the next neuron. And in all these cases, they're saying just to like chillax, you know, just don't worry about it right now. And here is a list of just some of the many effects in your body that can take place. And here we're really talking like in an extreme situation. You know, I mentioned earlier, we're always kind of facing stressors all the time, But just for clarity, let's imagine an extreme life-threatening situation and the types of changes that might happen, like your erector pili causing your hair to stand up, your pupils dilating to try to let in a little more light, perhaps help keep you safe, nostrils flaring to draw in more oxygen, sweating to maybe escape the clutches of something. It might be an evolutionary origin thing from primate. I'm not sure. Oh, and maybe also to help you cool down. Yeah, evaporative cooling from sweating. Dry mouth because digestion, not too important right now. Your cutaneous blood vessels constricting. So if you do sustain an injury in this very serious situation, you'll lose less blood. Respiration rate increasing and respiratory passages dilating and heart rate increasing. All of that is meant to deliver more oxygen to the places that need it most. If you're going to fight or flee, that's skeletal muscle. Your blood will clot faster, again, if there's an injury. You're going to be releasing a bunch of glucose from the liver, where it's been stored as glycogen. Suppress a bunch of organ systems you don't need, and again, we'll be releasing epinephrine from the adrenal glands to support these changes. So, this is all good stuff, and I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but especially things like this sugar being released if you're in a chronic stress situation, like there was these like famous children raised in an orphanage in Romania or somewhere years ago, or even like instances of domestic violence or things where you're suffering under this high stress situation for long periods of times. These changes can cause problems. Like you don't want changes to how your blood will clot. You want that at your normal level. You don't want to be constricting vessels and shutting down reproduction and digestion. So these stressors and also releasing this sugar, all of this can cause quite a lot of problems in the body from chronic stress. And you can learn more about that if you want. It's pretty interesting. So here's just kind of a one-page thing to grab your attention on a few things to remember. You want to know that the sympathetic nervous system arises in these stressful situations, but stressors can be almost anything. Remember that when we send these motor commands, because remember, we're in the ANS, this is all efferent information. This is having an effect on the body, information exiting the CNS to cause some effect. That signal to these organs will all come from the thoracic area and the lumbar area. Even if you're dilating your pupils, signal's going to come down, come out the spinal cord, and head up. The first neuron in that 2-neuron sequential pathways will be short, and the second one will be long. And when we form these ganglia, where one neuron meets the other, they have names. It's either going to be the sympathetic chain ganglia or the collateral ganglia. And then we learn the 3 types of collateral ganglia. So next we'll talk about parasympathetic division of the ANS.